My name's Malcolm Carter, and up until a few weeks ago I was just a regular guy. 28 years old, working as a high school English teacher in a small town outside Atlanta. I loved my job, loved my students, never thought twice about walking into that classroom every morning. Coffee in one hand, lesson plan in the other. Life wasn't perfect, but it was good, simple, predictable. That all changed the night I went out for a drink. It was a Friday, one of those long weeks that dragged like cement. I had just finished grading a mountain of essays, and my buddy, James, convinced me to grab a beer at a bar downtown. Nothing fancy, just a little spot where teachers and office workers went to unwind. We sat at the counter, talking about nothing, when I noticed her, blonde, blue-eyed, dressed like she stepped out of a department store catalog. She was at the other end of the bar, swaying a little, giggling too loud at something a guy said. I didn't think much of it. Just another girl who had a few too many. But then she caught my eye. She smiled, and for some reason I smiled back. Next thing I knew, she was beside me, drink in hand. "Hey," she said, stretching out the word like she wasn't sure if she was talking to me or just testing the sound of her own voice. "Hey," I answered. Up close, I could smell the alcohol on her breath. Whiskey, strong. "You're cute," she blurted out, tilting her head like she was studying me. I laughed, shaking my head. "You're drunk," she pouted. "Maybe a little." James shot me a look, the kind that said, "Don't do anything stupid." Not that I planned to. I wasn't interested, and even if I was, she was in no condition to be talking to anyone. "Let me buy you a drink," she offered, digging through her tiny purse. "I'm good," I said, turning back to James. "You should get some water." She didn't like that. Her face twisted, like I had insulted her. "You think I'm too drunk for you?" I sighed. "I think you should pace yourself." For a second, I thought that was the end of it. She stared at me, lips parted, like she wanted to say something. But then she just huffed and stumbled away. I didn't think about her again. Not until the police showed up at my apartment the next morning. The knock at the door came early, too early for a Saturday. Groggy, still in my boxers, I opened it, expecting maybe a neighbor or a delivery. Instead, I found two officers standing there, hands resting on their holsters. "Malcolm Carter?" My stomach tightened. "Yeah, you're under arrest." I blinked, convinced I had misheard them. "What?" One of them grabbed my wrist, yanking me forward. "Turn around." "Hold on. What's going on?" The next thing I knew, cold steel snapped around my wrists. My hands were behind my back. Panic surged through me like an electric shock. "You're being charged with assault." Assault? My mind raced. I had no enemies, no fights, nothing. "That's a mistake. I didn't assault anyone." The officer's grip tightened. "You can tell that to the judge." Neighbors peeked through their blinds as I was shoved into the back of the squad car. Shame burned through me. I wanted to scream, to fight, to demand answers, but I knew better. They drove me downtown, processed me like I was some common criminal. Mugshot, fingerprints, the whole humiliating routine. Then they put me in an interrogation room. That's when I saw her picture, the blonde from the bar. Her name was Emily Whitaker, and according to the police, she had filed a report saying I had assaulted her in the alley behind the bar after she left. My stomach twisted into a knot. This wasn't just bad. This was lethal. A black man, a white woman, a small-town jury. I could already see the headlines. I sat there in that cold, windowless interrogation room, my wrists still raw from the handcuffs. My heart pounded in my ears, but I forced myself to breathe. Stay calm. Think. The door swung open, and a man in a wrinkled suit strode in, tossing a file onto the table. He was tall, middle-aged, with thinning brown hair and sharp, pale eyes that had seen too many convictions to care whether this one was right or wrong. "Malcolm Carter," he said, dragging out my name like he was already disappointed in me. He pulled out a chair, sat down, and gave me a tight-lipped smile. "I'm Assistant District Attorney Paul Grayson. You know why you're here?" I swallowed. "No, actually, I don't." Grayson leaned back, lacing his fingers behind his head. "Well, according to Ms. Emily Whitaker, you followed her out of the bar last night, dragged her into an alley, and assaulted her." He let the words hang, waiting for my reaction. I stared at him, my skin prickling with something between disbelief and rage. "That's a lie." His smile didn't waver. "That's not what she says." I exhaled sharply, forcing my voice to stay steady. I spoke to her for maybe a minute. She was drunk. She tried to flirt, and I turned her down. That's it. I never left my seat. I never touched her. Grayson tapped his fingers on the table. You have an alibi? I hesitated. I was with my friend James Holloway. He was sitting right next to me the whole time. Grayson nodded like he was considering it, then casually flipped open the file. Well, here's the problem, Malcolm. We have security footage from the bar's parking lot. It shows Emily Whitaker stumbling out, and 2 minutes later, a man following her. He pushed a grainy black and white photo across the table. It was blurry, barely recognizable, but the figure in the image had my build, my complexion. Could have been anyone. I clenched my jaw. That's not me. Grayson shrugged. Jury might think otherwise. A cold sweat broke out on my back. I knew what this was. A setup. A rush to convict. A case too tempting for a prosecutor like Grayson to pass up. A white woman accusing a black man of assault? The media would eat it up. The public would demand justice. And Grayson, he'd be the man who put me away. I didn't do this, I said again, my voice steel. Grayson leaned in, his face unreadable. I'll be straight with you, Malcolm. We both know juries don't like cases like this. They like certainty. And right now, all they'll see is a drunk, scared woman pointing her finger at you. And a blurry image that looks close enough to stick. He folded his hands. Now you could fight this. Drag it out. But I don't need much to win. A scared victim, a grainy photo, and an all-white jury? That's a conviction waiting to happen. My stomach turned. You want me to plead guilty to something I didn't do? Grayson gave me a patient look. Plead guilty to a lesser charge. Maybe assault, maybe reckless endangerment. You'll do some time, but not too much. Or, he spread his hands. Roll the dice in court. If you lose, you're looking at 10, maybe 15 years. I felt like I couldn't breathe. This wasn't justice. This was a game. And Grayson wasn't offering me a deal. He was offering me a way out before he buried me. I met his gaze. I'm not confessing to something I didn't do. Grayson's expression didn't change, but I saw the flicker of annoyance in his eyes. He stood, smoothing out his wrinkled suit. Suit yourself. But I wouldn't get too comfortable. Then he walked out, leaving me alone with the weight of what was coming. Jail is a different world. The air is stale, thick with sweat and bad decisions. The walls hum with the sound of people trying to convince themselves they don't belong there. Some don't. Most do. I spent my first night in a holding cell, crammed in with 3 other men. One drunk, one tweaking, one just staring at the wall like he'd seen too much. I didn't sleep. My mind wouldn't let me. James came the next morning. He showed up with my lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Vanessa Hayes. She looked like she hadn't slept either, but the moment she stepped into the visitor's room, she was all business. They're railroading you, she said, setting down a thick folder. No kidding. James sat across from me, jaw tight. Malcolm, man, I told them you didn't leave the bar. You were right next to me the whole time. Vanessa nodded. We have James's statement, but here's the problem. Grayson doesn't care. He's got Emily Whitaker, and in cases like this, juries believe the victim. If the prosecutor tells them you're a predator, they'll see one, no matter what the evidence says. I exhaled, forcing down the frustration clawing at my ribs. Then we need more than just James's word. What about security cameras? Vanessa pulled out a few blurry screenshots from the bar's parking lot footage. The same ones Grayson had shoved in my face. A dark figure walking behind Emily. A shape that could be me. This is all they have? I asked. It's all they want to have, Vanessa corrected. The footage conveniently cuts off before we see the man's face or what happens next. And get this, there were 3 cameras outside that bar, but the prosecution only submitted footage from one. James sat forward. So what about the other 2? Vanessa's lips pressed into a thin line. Grayson claims the other angles weren't working. Bull. I knew it. She knew it. But proving it? That was another story. James shook his head, his fists clenching. This is crazy. They can't just decide what evidence to use. They do it all the time, Vanessa muttered. A sick feeling curled in my gut. I wasn't stupid, I knew how these things played out. A white woman accuses a black man of something, and suddenly, it doesn't matter what's true. Only what people want to believe. Vanessa leaned in. Listen to me, Malcolm. I believe you. James believes you. But believing isn't enough. We need something that forces them to back off. I met her gaze. And if we don't find it? She hesitated. Then you're looking at trial. And if Grayson gets his way, a conviction. James muttered a curse under his breath. We're not letting that happen. Vanessa sighed. We need time to dig. I filed a motion to demand all security footage from that night. If there's another angle, we'll find it. I nodded, gripping the edge of the table. Then do it. Vanessa stood, gathering her files. I'll be in touch. James lingered, eyes full of something that looked too close to guilt. I should have made you leave with me that night. I shook my head. You didn't do this. She did. He exhaled sharply. I swear, we're gonna clear your name. I wanted to believe that. I needed to believe that. But as the guards led me back to my cell, I couldn't shake the feeling that belief wasn't going to be enough. Jail strips you down, not just physically but mentally. The longer you sit in a cell, the more the walls close in, whispering things you don't want to hear. What if you lose? What if no one believes you? What if this is where your life ends? I tried to push those thoughts away, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw the headlines. Local teacher arrested for assault. Black man charged in attack on young woman. It didn't matter that I was innocent. To the world outside, I was already guilty. Then, 3 days in, Vanessa showed up again. I was led into the visitor's room, chains rattling around my wrists, my body stiff from a bed made of steel and regret. She was already sitting at the table, her face unreadable. I sat down. Tell me you have something. She exhaled, sliding a folder across the table. We got the footage. My pulse jumped. And Vanessa flipped it open, revealing printed stills from a different camera angle. One that showed the alley behind the bar. I leaned forward. The images were clearer than the ones the prosecution had. The timestamps matched the moment Emily Whitaker claimed I had attacked her. And right there, in black and white, was the truth. A man taller than me wearing a dark hoodie. His face was turned away, but it sure as hell wasn't mine. And Emily? She wasn't being dragged anywhere. She was laughing, pulling at the man's jacket, stumbling over her own feet. Vanessa tapped the image. This is what Grayson didn't want us to see. I swallowed hard. This was it. Proof. The evidence that should have cleared me the moment it surfaced. James had been right. The cameras had been working. Grayson just chose to ignore them. My voice was tight. We take this to the judge, right? File a motion to dismiss. Vanessa hesitated, and my stomach dropped. What? I demanded. She exhaled. Grayson's refusing to acknowledge it. My head snapped up. What? She rubbed her temple. I sent it to his office. Called him directly. You know what he said? Her jaw tightened. The jury will decide what's relevant. I gripped the table so hard my fingers ached. You're telling me we have proof, and he's still pushing this case? Vanessa's eyes darkened. Because he doesn't care about the truth, Malcolm. He cares about winning. And if this goes to trial, he knows a jury will feel for Emily more than they'll believe you. A hot, bitter rage curled in my chest. This wasn't justice. This wasn't a mistake. This was deliberate. I forced my voice steady. So what do we do? Vanessa leaned in, her voice low. If Grayson wants to pretend this footage doesn't exist, we make sure the whole world sees it. I stared at her, understanding dawning. You're saying we leak it? She nodded. Your family, your friends, someone posts it. If the public gets a hold of it, they'll demand answers. And once the media sinks its teeth in, Grayson won't be able to ignore it anymore. A slow, dangerous hope stirred in my gut. For the first time since my arrest, I had a weapon, and I was ready to use it. The footage went online that night. James sent it to Malcolm's younger sister, Brianna, who didn't hesitate. She uploaded the video to every platform she could. Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, with the caption, "My brother was falsely accused. Here's the proof." First, it was just a few shares, a handful of people expressing outrage. But then it caught fire. A journalist from Atlanta picked it up, retweeting it with, "Newly surfaced footage contradicts key evidence in Malcolm Carter's assault case. Why is the prosecution ignoring it?" That's when everything exploded. By morning, #FreeMalcolmCarter was trending. Thousands of people reposted the video demanding justice. Celebrities, activists, even lawyers started weighing in. Some called for the case to be thrown out. Others demanded Grayson's resignation. And just like that, Malcolm's trial wasn't just a local case anymore. It was national news. Malcolm sat in his cell when the guards came. He expected another round of legal nonsense, maybe even a warning to stop making waves. But instead, he was taken to a private room where Vanessa was waiting. Phone in hand, looking more fired up than he'd ever seen her. She grinned. "You're everywhere, Malcolm." She turned the screen toward him. News clips, protest footage, tweets flooding the timeline. People standing outside the courthouse, holding signs with his name. Malcolm's throat tightened. People actually care? Vanessa's smile faded, turning serious. They care because they see the truth. And now, Grayson has no choice but to face it. She leaned forward, voice firm. "We just got a call from the judge. There's an emergency hearing this afternoon. They have to address the new evidence." For the first time in days, Malcolm let himself believe. He might actually walk out of here, but not before making sure Grayson burned with him. The courthouse was surrounded. Hundreds of people packed the steps, chanting, holding signs, demanding justice. Reporters swarmed, cameras flashing, microphones shoved forward as Vanessa and I were led inside. The guards barely kept the crowd back. Inside, the courtroom was tense. The judge, a stone-faced man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, adjusted his glasses as he glanced at the file in front of him. Grayson sat stiffly at the prosecution's table, his usual smug confidence replaced with something colder. He wasn't used to being on defense. Vanessa stood. "Your Honor, we have undeniable proof that Malcolm Carter is innocent. The footage clearly shows another man in the alley with Emily Whitaker. And yet, the prosecution suppressed this evidence." She turned toward Grayson, her voice sharp. "They deliberately withheld the truth in order to secure a conviction." Grayson didn't flinch. "Your Honor, the jury is the appropriate venue to weigh evidence." The judge cut him off. "Save it, counselor." He turned to me, his eyes scanning the stills from the security footage. I held my breath as he set them down. Then he exhaled and looked back up. "The case against Malcolm Carter is dismissed. Mr. Carter, you are free to go." A breath I hadn't realized I was holding escaped me. The room erupted. Cheers, shouts, the distant sound of people outside celebrating. My hands clenched into fists. It was over. I was free. Grayson wasn't. The moment I walked out of that courthouse, his career started to unravel. The footage wasn't just proof of my innocence. It was proof of his corruption. News outlets dug deeper. Turns out, my case wasn't the first time he had twisted evidence to get a conviction. Other defense attorneys came forward, exposing years of misconduct. By the end of the week, his office was flooded with calls demanding his resignation. By the end of the month, he was under investigation. By the end of the year, he was disbarred. And I walked back into my classroom. My students stood and clapped. My name was cleared. My life was mine again. But I'd never be the same. Because I learned something in that cell, in that courtroom, in that fight to prove my innocence. Justice isn't given. Sometimes you have to take it. If the story resonated with you, share it with those who need to hear it. Let's start conversations that matter and that will lead to change. Subscribe to our channel for more stories like this that challenge us, inspire us, and remind us of what we are capable of when we stand up for what is right.